The chronicle of our world does not begin with the crowning of kings or the forging of steel, but with a silence so profound it preceded the very concept of sound. In the primordial era, before the foundations of the North were laid, the world was a singular, undifferentiated expanse of white mist. This was the age of the Old One, a being of such vast, incomprehensible magnitude that its very breath was the colorless fog. The lore of this dawn is the lore of the primordial hunger. The Old One was not a creator, but a consumer, a cosmic sponge designed to soak up the soul, the fundamental spark of life, until the universe returned to a state of quiescent nothingness. This first era is known to the few scholars of the Nexus as the First Scourge, a time when the world was nearly extinguished before it had truly begun to glow. It is the history of the original void, and it sets the stage for everything that would eventually fall. The intervention that saved the world from this first inhalation came from the Monumentals. These were beings of ancient wisdom and withered grace, who realized that the soul was both the light of man and the lure of the beast. To prevent the total erasure of existence, the Monumentals engaged in a great work of metaphysical engineering. They lulled the Old One back into a deep, artificial slumber beneath the earth. The lore of this act is the lore of the heavy sleep. Their purpose was the quarantine of the infinite. By binding the Old One, they allowed the fog to recede, leaving behind a world that was physical, tangible, and mortal. To ensure that the Old One remained undisturbed, the Monumentals partitioned the world into 6 distinct realms, each connected to the Nexus, a temple that exists between the world of the living and the deep of the dead. To maintain this delicate balance, the Monumentals created the Archstones. These massive, crystalline monoliths were placed in the hearts of the great civilizations, acting as anchors of reality. They were the gifts of order. Each archstone was intended to limit the ambition of the people within its reach. There was the archstone of the Small King, the Burrower King, the Queen of the Ivory Tower, the Shadowmen, and the Chieftains of the Lost. A 6th archstone, belonging to the Giants of the North, was also forged, though its history would later be shattered and lost to the snows. The purpose of the archstones was the regulation of the soul. As long as man used his soul for mortal ends, for building, for love, and for survival, the Old One would remain asleep. This established the era of the Long Peace, a period of thousands of years where the soul arts were forbidden and forgotten, hidden away like a poison in a golden box. In this atmosphere of enforced ignorance, the kingdom of Boletaria began to rise. It started as a collection of nomadic tribes in the freezing north, men and women who were hardened by the weight of the stone and the bite of the wind. The lore of the northern ascent is the lore of the hardening of the spirit. These early Boletarians did not seek magic. They sought steel. They built their homes into the cliffs and their fortresses into the mountains. This was the age of the physical empire. Under the guidance of the early Allant dynasty, Boletaria became the pillar of the north, a kingdom of high walls and heavy shields. Their purpose was the establishment of the human domain. They believed that through labor and loyalty, they could create a world that did not need gods. This reveals the gilded hubris that would eventually lead to the Second Scourge. The North believed it was impenetrable because its walls were made of granite, unaware that the foundation was made of fog. The crowning of King Allant XII marked the zenith of this physical glory. Allant was a unifier, a man of titanic will, who brought the disparate regions of the North under a single, prosperous banner. Under his reign, the Nexus was seen only as a mythological relic, and the Monumentals had withered into statues of flesh. The world was full of life, yet it was a life of the surface. The lore suggests that Allant was the perfect king for a perfect world. He expanded the Boletarian palace until it touched the clouds, and he commissioned the Stonefang tunnels to be dug until the earth groaned. His purpose was the immortalization of the dynasty. He wanted Boletaria to be a monument that would never crumble. This reveals the static dream of the Golden Age. Allant wanted to stop the clock of history. He did not realize that stagnation is the first step toward rot. and that by trying to hold the world too tightly, he was inviting the deep to take it from him. As Allant aged, the melancholy of the crown began to take hold. He looked at his aging knights, the legendary Twin Fangs, Valorfax and Bayer, and he looked at his own fading strength. The lore of the king's despair explains that Allant began to resent the mortality of his kingdom. He felt that steel and stone were lies because they could not preserve the soul. It was this existential grief that led him to the forbidden archives and the hidden clefts of the frozen north. He rediscovered the soul arts, the ancient science that the Monumentals had buried. His purpose shifted from governance to transcendence. He believed that if he could wake the Old One just enough to drink from the fog, he could grant his kingdom eternal vitality. This was the tragic miscalculation of the Savior. Allant thought he was opening a well, but he was opening a grave. The moment Allant beckoned, the Old One marks the end of the first chronicle and the beginning of the fall. The colorless fog did not come as a healing mist, but as a silent eraser. It rolled over the mountains of Boletaria, muffling the bells and softening the walls. The lore of the Second Awakening is the lore of the inhalation of the world. As the fog settled, the soul arts returned to the land, but they were corrupted. The soul was no longer a spark of life. It became a currency of the damned. The Old One, having been nudged from its sleep, began to exhale the demons' beings made of pure soul hunger, wearing the shapes of men's fears. The rise of the fog was the final admission that the long peace was over. The history of the North was now a history of the harvest. The legacy of this first part of our chronicle is the horror of the reawakened void. We realize that the world we know is merely a thin crust over an infinite hunger. The purpose of the Monumentals was to hide the truth, but the purpose of Allant was to expose it. As the fog settles over the first archstone, the Slayer understands that the history of the Old One is the history of the breath, a breath that was held for an eternity and is now being released to snuff out the candle of man. The kingdom stands at the edge of the abyss, and the first gate of the palace is about to creak open to the night. The second chapter in our 15-part chronicle of the world explores the initial erosion of the Boletarian spirit as the majestic palace, once a symbol of eternal stability, became a vertical slaughterhouse. When King Allant XII returned from the frozen north, he did not come alone. He brought the colorless fog in his wake, trailing behind him like a funeral shroud. The lore of this era is the lore of the dissolving of the social contract. Within days, the order that had taken centuries to build began to liquefy. The purpose of the fog's arrival at the palace was the systematic deconstruction of identity. It did not kill the inhabitants. It subtracted their will, leaving behind a kingdom of empty vessels. The history of the palace siege is the history of the first consumption, where the citizen was replaced by the husk and the high walls became a cage for the soulless. As the mist permeated the stone corridors, the common foot soldiers and the peasantry were the first to succumb. This gave rise to the dreglings, the lowest tier of the soul-starved. The lore of the dreglings' hunger provides a window into the metabolic nightmare of the fall. A dregling is a man whose humanity has been evaporated by the fog, leaving only a primal, ravenous instinct to consume the souls of others to fill the void within. Their purpose was the creation of the biological hazard. They were no longer people. They were environmental obstacles. This reveals the parasitic logic of the Old One. It uses the population to hunt the population. The rise of the dregling was the death of the community, turning the streets of Boletaria into a feeding ground where the neighbor became the predator. The tragedy deepened as the fog reached the elite echelons of the military, the Boletarian Knights. These men, who had sworn oaths of iron, found their virtues turned into vices. The lore of the blue-eyed and red-eyed corruption suggests that the more powerful the soul, the more terrifying the demon it produces. These knights did not become mindless slaves like the dreglings. they became disciplined monsters. Their purpose was the enforcement of the harvest. They continued to patrol the ramparts and guard the gates, but they were no longer protecting the palace. They were securing the larder for the old one. This reveals the irony of the armor. The protection they once offered the weak was now the shield that preserved the rot. The rise of the Demon Knight was the final betrayal of the shield. Amidst this chaos, the human heart of the palace attempted a final, desperate stand. This was the era of the Twin Fangs, Valorfax and Bayer. The lore of their divergent paths represents the fracturing of the Northern Hope. Valorfax, the Swift Fang, realized that the palace was a lost cause and made a miraculous escape through the fog to warn the outside world. His purpose was the preservation of the warning. Conversely, Bayer, the Heavy Fang, remained behind, eventually becoming entombed in the dungeons. His purpose was the stagnant vigil. This reveals the philosophical split of the fall. One Fang sought the light, while the other accepted the dark. The history of the Twin Fangs is a history of the broken pair, proving that even the strongest brotherhood could not hold the gate against the inhalation of the soul. The physical transformation of the palace architecture during the siege provides insight into the aesthetic of the abyss. The once bright banners of the Allant dynasty turned the color of ash, and the eternal fires of the braziers began to glow with a cold, pale blue. The lore of the shifting stone explains that the palace was becoming a living organism of the fog. The fog gates began to manifest physical barriers of soul matter that sequestered different wards of the city. Their purpose was the fragmentation of the resistance. By dividing the space, the demons ensured that the slayer or any survivor would be isolated and overwhelmed. This shows that the history of the palace had become a history of the labyrinth, where the home was reimagined as a slaughterhouse floor. The relationship between the siege and the red and blue dragons represents the aerial dominion of the fall. These dragons, once the noble icons of the king's crest, were magnified by the soul arts into monstrous sentinels. They took up residence on the Lord's path, their purpose being the total denial of the approach. They were the fire that guarded the fog. This reveals the bestial perversion of the Allant era. The king used the natural world to cremate his own subjects. The rise of the Dragon Scourge was the end of the open road, turning the gateway to the kingdom into a corridor of ash and bone. The act concludes with the manifestation of the first true demon of the palace, the Phalanx, a mass of soul slime and shields. The Phalanx is the literal amalgamation of the palace guard who huddled together in the dark until they merged into a single monstrosity. Its purpose was the collective despair. It represents the end of the individual soldier. The Slayer realizes that the demons are not foreign invaders, but the condensed grief of the Boletarian people. The rise of the Slime Demon is the final shape of the palace garrison. The legacy of the siege in this chapter is the horror of the familiar. We realize that evil did not arrive in Boletaria. It was grown from the good that was already there. The purpose of the workshop of the palace was to build a kingdom, but the purpose of the fog was to melt it. As the Slayer stands before the iron gates of the inner ward, they understand that the history of the siege is the history of the mirror, a mirror that showed the king his own failure until the glass was stained with blood. The third chapter in our 15-part chronicle moves from the blood-slicked battlements of the outer walls to the Lord's path, the grand bridge that connects the common city to the inner sanctum of the king. This era is defined by the lore of the monumental obstacle. As the colorless fog solidified its grip, the physical might that King Allant XII once used to protect his people underwent a grotesque magnification, manifesting in the form of the Tower Knight. This demon is the spiritual and physical remains of Alfred, the Knight of the Tower, the highest-ranking guardian of the inner gates. His transformation reveals the cruelest aspect of the Old One's purpose, to take a man's virtue of protection and twist it into a mandate of absolute embargo. The history of the Lord's Path is the history of the fortress of the Iron Will, where the shield became a crushing weight and the guardian became a gatekeeper of the grave. The lore of the Knight Alfred provides the human tragedy behind the towering metal. Alfred was known as the Iron Will of the North, a man whose loyalty to the crown was as unshakable as the mountains themselves. When the fog arrived, Alfred did not flee to the Nexus or seek the safety of the dungeon depths. He stood his ground at the head of the bridge. The lore of the Unbreakable Vow suggests that the Old One rewarded this loyalty by granting Alfred the size to match his duty. He was elevated into a Titan of steel. His purpose shifted from defending the king to denying the truth. The Tower Knight exists to ensure that no slayer or survivor reaches the inner palace to see the rotted reality of Allant's throne. This reveals the sealing purpose of the demons. They are the locks on the doors of the past, preserving the lie of the kingdom by crushing the inquiry. The physical design of the great shield carried by the demon provides insight into the defensive despair of the fall. The shield is not a tool of active combat, but a mobile wall of stone. The lore of the immovable object explains that the Tower Knight's purpose was the psychological demoralization of the hero. When a traveler sees a knight that towers over the very buildings of the city, wielding a shield the size of a gatehouse, they realize that human effort is futile. This was the era of the stagnant defense. The demon does not seek out enemies to hunt. He waits for them to break themselves against his iron. This reveals the passive aggression of the Old One's purpose. It wants the world to give up and lie down in the fog. The rise of the Great Shield was the closing of the path to redemption, where the shield of the people became the lid of the coffin. The relationship between the Tower Knight and the archers of the ramparts represents the ecosystem of the siege. The Tower Knight is not a lone combatant. He is a centerpiece of a military machine. The lore suggests that the archers surrounding his arena are the ghostly echoes of Alfred's personal battalion, kept in a state of eternal readiness by the fog. Their purpose was the multi-layered execution. While the knight crushes the front with his lance and shield, the archers pick off the weak from the heights. This reveals the tactical cruelty of the fall. The demons remember how to fight as a unit. This was the era of the organized nightmare. The order of the Boletarian military was preserved, but it was infected with a soulless precision. The rise of the demon army was the final perversion of the Boletarian drill. Furthermore, the lore of the Lance of Light represents the arcane adulteration of the martial arts. Alfred was a physical warrior, a master of the mundane spear, yet his demonic form can project spikes of soul energy from his weapon. This reveals the invasive purpose of the soul arts. They pollute the steel until the weapon is no longer metal, but will. The purpose of the light lance was the reach of the abyss. It showed the survivors that even if they stayed far away, the demon could touch them. This shows that the history of the fall is a history of the stretching dark, where safety was an illusion that could be pierced by the radiance of the void. The rise of the light spear was the end of the fair fight. The lore of the Iron Demon Soul, the item dropped upon his defeat, represents the marrow of the machine. The soul is described as tough and unyielding. This reveals the petrification of the spirit. Alfred's soul had become as hard as his armor, losing all humanity in the process. The purpose of the Iron Soul was the hardening of the scourge. It provided the weight necessary to anchor the fog to the physical world of the palace. This shows that the history of the Tower Knight is a history of the statue, where a man's legacy was turned to lead. The rise of the Iron Soul in the hands of the Slayer is the only way to forge a weapon capable of shattering the gate that leads to the inner ward. The act concludes with the silent collapse of the giant. When the Tower Knight falls, the dust of his armor chokes the courtyard, and the spirit of Alfred is finally released into the Nexus. The Slayer realizes that there was no man left inside the suit, only mist and memory. The purpose of the Tower Knight was to be the monument of the king's hubris. He was the statue that Allant built to his own strength, and his fall is the shattering of the king's ego. The Slayer understands that the Lord's path is now clear, but the inner palace is now exposed, and the Red Moon is waiting behind the next fog gate. The legacy of the Tower Knight in this chapter is the horror of the imposing silence. We realize that duty without soul is just a mechanical meat grinder. The purpose of the Workshop of the North was to make men into walls, and the Tower Knight was the final wall. As the Slayer walks past the hollow helmet of the fallen giant, they understand that the history of Alfred is the history of the shield, a shield that protected the Wound until it festered into a world-ending rot. The fourth chapter in our 15-part Chronicle of the World ascends the blood-stained steps into the inner ward, the high-arched residential and administrative heart of the palace. Here, the vicious grace of the kingdom's elite has been distilled into a nightmare of silver and crimson. In this theater of execution stands the Penetrator, the demonic transfiguration of Metas, the Knight of the Lance. While the Tower Knight represented the immovable shield, the Penetrator represents the lore of the irresistible edge. His purpose is the sanitization of the sanctum. He is the personal assassin of the corrupted throne, a being whose sole existence is to pierce the heart of any hope that remains in Boletaria. His transformation reveals a terrifying truth about the Old One's purpose. It does not just bloat the flesh into giants. It sharpens the human will to kill into a fine, lethal point. The history of the inner ward is the history of the corruption of the King's Blade, where chivalry was distilled into execution. The lore of the Knight Metas provides the tragic foundation for this dealer of death. In the Golden Age, Metas was the king's swift justice, a man whose speed with a blade was said to be faster than the fog. He was the surgical strike to Alfred's blunt force. When the kingdom fell, Metas did not succumb to the slow rot of the Dreglings. He embraced the soul arts to reach a pinnacle of technique that was previously impossible for a mortal. The lore of the Sanguine Perfection suggests that his purpose shifted from justice to pure lethality. He became the demon of the thrust, a being that no longer fights but erases. This reveals the elitist purpose of the fall. The higher the knight's rank, the more focused their demonic hunger becomes. The rise of the Penetrator was the fall of the fair duel, proving that in the end, Allant's best men were merely better monsters. The physical design of the penetrating sword provides insight into the aerodynamic sadism of the fall. The sword is unnaturally long, needle-thin, and glows with a pale, malevolent moonlight. The lore of the Thirsting Point explains that the weapon's purpose was the negation of the armor. In the history of the North, heavy plate was the sign of safety. The Penetrator was designed to mock that safety. His lunge can traverse the entire arena in a heartbeat, bypassing the great shields of the heroes. This was the era of the vulnerable knight. This reveals the psychological cruelty of the Old One. It wants its victims to know that there is no shelter from the king's will. The rise of the penetrating blade was the death of the defensive philosophy, replacing the solid wall with the searing needle. The relationship between the Penetrator and the fat officials represents the sycophantic hierarchy of the fall. While the Penetrator provides the steel, the officials, the corpulent, laughing ministers of Allant's court, provide the cruelty. The lore suggests that the Penetrator acts as the muscle for these bureaucratic demons. Their purpose was the systematic dismantling of the citizenry. Together, they turned the inner ward into a processing plant for souls, laughing as they burned the unworthy and harvested the strong. This reveals the administrative horror of Boletaria's end. It was managed with gleeful efficiency. This was the era of the smiling tyrant. The order of the kingdom was not broken. It was weaponized against the very people it was built to serve. The rise of this triumvirate of terror was the final betrayal of the social contract. Furthermore, the lore of the silver armor represents the preservation of the facade. Unlike the rotted wood of the valley or the decayed flesh of the swamp, the Penetrator remains polished and bright. This reveals the vain purpose of the king's inner circle. They wanted to look like gods, while they acted like beasts. This was the era of the gilded rot. The purpose of the silver plating was to hide the emptiness of the demon within. This shows that the history of the fall is a history of the mask, where the more beautiful the surface, the deeper the corruption. The rise of the polished demon was the end of the moral compass, where beauty and evil became indistinguishable, and the king's light became a cold, killing silver. The lore of the silver demon's soul represents the sharpness of the sin. The soul is described as focused and cold. This reveals the freezing of the empathy. Metas had pushed his skill so far that he had severed his connection to human feeling. The purpose of the silver soul was the refinement of the scourge. It provided the intellect behind the violence. This shows that the history of the penetrator is a history of the needle, where the scourge was injected into the veins of the world with pinpoint accuracy. The rise of the silver soul in the hands of the slayer is the only way to learn the art of the divine thrust, turning the enemy's technique into the world's salvation. The act concludes with the silent bow of the fallen duelist. When the penetrator is defeated, he does not scream or curse. He dissipates into a cloud of silver dust, leaving his plume to flutter in the wind. The slayer realizes that they have not killed a man, but extinguished a technique. The purpose of the penetrator was to be the ultimate test of the slayer's reflex. He was the gatekeeper of the king's person, and his fall is the shattering of the king's guard. The slayer understands that the throne room is now unprotected, and the true face of King Allant is waiting at the top of the elevator. The legacy of the penetrator in this chapter is the horror of the vicious grace. We realize that skill without heart is just a beautiful murder machine. The purpose of the workshop of the palace was to make men into swords, and the penetrator was the final blade. As the slayer steps over the broken rapier of the fallen knight and looks toward the great elevator that leads to the king, they understand that the history of metas is the history of the edge, an edge that cut the world until there was nothing left to bleed but light and mist. The fifth chapter in our 15-part chronicle of the world reaches the vertical apex of the north, the throne of the sun, where the hollow divinity of the kingdom is finally revealed to the wind and the stars. Here, at the highest point of the king's tower, sits the false King Allant, a being of terrifying poise and radiant, golden power. However, the lore of this encounter is the lore of the divine impostor. This is not the true King Allant 12, but a demon twin, a construct of pure, high-density soul energy molded in the image of the king at the height of his glory. The purpose of the false king is the eternal preservation of the lie, while the true, physical King Allant retreated into the bowels of the old one to seek the end of all pain. He left this simulacrum to rule over the ruins. His transformation reveals the ultimate nihilism of the fall, that the king's final gift to his people was a spirit of purest malice, wearing the mask of authority. The history of the King's Tower is the history of the abandonment of the flesh, where the icon became more real than the man. The lore of the simulacrum provides the philosophical core of the kingdom's collapse. The true Allant had grown weary of the futility of human endeavor. He saw that even the greatest kings eventually rot, and even the strongest walls eventually crumble. His purpose shifted to the transcendence of identity. By creating the false king, he extracted his own greatness, ambition, and majesty, leaving his humanity behind to be consumed by the deep. This was the birth of the absolute tyrant. The false king possesses no mercy, no doubt, and no regret. He is the platonic ideal of a king, a being that exists only to rule and destroy. This reveals the satirical purpose of the fall. The Old One took Allant's highest aspirations and turned them into a god of the void. The rise of the false king was the fall of the human king, proving that perfection is just another word for death. The physical combat style of the false king provides insight into the lethal elegance of the soul. He does not fight with the grime of a warrior. He moves with a stately speed that defies the laws of physics. His signature technique, the Soul Sucker, allows him to literally drain the levels of the Slayer. The lore of the regression of the spirit explains that the false king's purpose is the erasure of progress. He does not just kill the body. He deletes the history of the hero, pulling the experience out of their marrow. This was the era of the Great Reversal. It reveals the spiritual predation of the Allant dynasty, a king who feeds on the potential of his subjects. The rise of the soul-sucking king was the end of the heroic myth, where experience is just another resource to be harvested by the throne. The relationship between the false king and the storm of the wings represents the celestial sovereignty of the fall. From his high perch atop the spire, the false king commands the sky. The lore suggests that the white fog at the top of the palace is his exhale. His purpose was the creation of the divine vacuum. By standing at the highest point, he ensures that the souls of the entire kingdom rise toward him, drawn upward like smoke to a flue. This reveals the atmospheric horror of Boletaria's end. It was an inverted funnel, where every drop of life in the streets below was being sucked into the spire. This was the era of the vertical harvest. The rise of the false sun was the drying out of the earthly kingdom, turning the palace into a drain for the essence of man. Furthermore, the lore of the soul brand represents the manifestation of malice. While the true king carries the demon brand into the darkness, the false king wields a blade of pure intent. The lore of the blade of the will suggests that the weapon's power is inversely proportional to the character of the wielder. This reveals the inverse purpose of the Allant era. He sought power through depravity. The purpose of the sword was the cleaving of reality. It showed that evil could be bright, beautiful, and golden. This shows that the history of the fall is a history of the optical illusion, where the brightest light in the kingdom was actually the center of the darkness. The rise of the shimmering blade was the death of discernment, where the people followed the glow straight into the abyss. The lore of the false king's demon soul represents the weight of the crown. The soul is described as radiant and cold, lacking the warmth or chaos of a living being. This reveals the crystallization of hubris. Allant had turned himself into a gemstone, a cold object to be admired but never touched. The purpose of the false soul was the solidification of the scourge. It acted as the capstone of the archstone of the king, anchoring the demonic presence to the world of man. This shows that the history of the false king is a history of the statue, where the ruler became a monument to his own hatred. The rise of the radiant soul in the hands of the Slayer is the only key to opening the final seal of the Nexus, allowing the traveler to finally face the truth hidden beneath the temple. The act concludes with the final breath of the impostor. As the false king dissipates into golden particles under the Slayer's blade, he whispers of the mercy of the Old One. The Slayer realizes that they have defeated the shadow, but the substance is still waiting elsewhere. The purpose of the false king was to be the ultimate distraction. He was the beautiful lie that kept the world from looking into the ugly truth of the king's actual fate. The Slayer understands that the throne is empty because the king is no longer king. He has become a parasite in the belly of the beast. The rise of the fallen king is the final revelation of the northern history. The legacy of the false king in this chapter is the horror of the hollow divinity. We realize that authority without empathy is just a beautiful executioner. The purpose of the workshop of the spire was to make a god out of a monster, and the false king was the final product. As the Slayer looks out from the broken spire over the choked horizon of Boletaria, seeing the fog extend to the ends of the earth, they understand that the history of the false king is the history of the mirror, a mirror that showed the kingdom what it wanted to see until it broke, leaving behind only the cold, hard shards of the void. The 6th chapter in our 15-part chronicle of the world descends from the airy, windswept spires of the palace into the suffocating, subterranean heat of the Stonefang tunnels. If the palace was the mind of the kingdom, Stonefang was its body, the industrial engine that fueled Allant's expansion through the relentless extraction of ore. The lore of this region is the lore of the subterranean grind. The purpose of Stonefang was the mechanical sustenance of the north. For generations, the excavators, a race of hardy, long-lived miners, toiled in the dark to provide the iron for the Tower Knight's armor and the hardstone for the palace walls. However, the fall of Boletaria brought a molten corruption to these depths, turning the workplace into a foundry of the soul. The history of the Stonefang tunnels is the history of the greed of the excavators, where the search for resource became a worship of the flame, and the miners were forged into the very tools they once wielded. The lore of the excavator's stagnation provides the industrial tragedy of the district. These were not slaves in the traditional sense, but a people whose entire identity was defined by the dig. They were a culture of stone and soot. When the colorless fog seeped into the tunnels, it did not find faith or chivalry to corrupt. It found toil. The lore of the endless shift suggests that the fog locked the miners into their labor, turning their routine into a curse. Their purpose shifted from mining for the king to mining for the void. The scale miners you encounter are hollowed by their own diligence. They continue to pick at the walls even as their flesh turns to stone and their eyes go blind. This reveals the automated purpose of the fall. The Old One takes the routine of a civilization and turns it into a cycle of eternal exhaustion. The rise of the stone miner was the fall of human dignity. The physical environment of the smithing grounds provides insight into the thermodynamic horror of the fall. As the soul arts permeated the rock, the natural heat of the earth became sentient. The lore of the fever of the deep explains that the purpose of the tunnels became the incubation of the primal fire. The fat officials, those same ministerial demons from the palace, were sent by Allant to oversee the production of souls in the heat. They used whips and fire to overclock the miners, pushing the foundry beyond its physical limits. This reveals the administrative greed of the Allant era. He did not just want ore, he wanted the heat of the human spirit to be smelted into power. This was the era of the human foundry. The rise of the molten industry was the charring of the kingdom's heart. The relationship between the miners and the armor spider represents the industrial trap of the fall. Tucked away at the end of a narrow tunnel, the spider acts as a biological gate. The lore suggests that the spider was a natural predator of the tunnels that was magnified by the fog to act as a security system for the deep. Its purpose was the filtration of the intruder. By weaving webs of steel and spitting fire, it ensured that the secrets of the excavation remained buried. This reveals the claustrophobic purpose of the Old One. It wants its larders to be hard to reach. The rise of the demonic arachnid was the sealing of the mine, turning a place of work into a tomb of web and ash. Furthermore, the lore of the dragon stone and the clear stone represents the mineralization of the soul. In Stonefang, the soul does not float in the air like a mist. It hardens into crystals within the rock. The lore of the geological echo suggests that these ores are the condensed memories of the ancient dragons that once ruled the world. The purpose of the excavation was the resurrection of the primeval. Allant realized that if he could dig deep enough, he could find the power that existed before man. This reveals the archaic purpose of the fall. The history of the future was being unearthed from the grave of the past. This shows that the history of Stonefang is a history of the drill, where the search for knowledge was replaced by the search for the spark. The lore of the filthy man represents the parasitic remnant of the industry. He hoards scraps and ores at the entrance, waiting for a slayer to trade. His purpose is the exploitation of the decay. He is the human face of the greed that destroyed the tunnels. He doesn't care about the demons or the king. He only cares about the profit of the pile. This reveals the petty nihilism of the fall. While the gods are fighting, the small men are stripping the copper from the walls. The rise of the filthy scavenger was the end of the community, where survival became a transaction and brotherhood was sold for a shard of stone. The act concludes with the discovery of the great dragon in the lava pits. As the Slayer descends further, they find the remains of the Ancient Ones being reanimated by the fog. The purpose of the Stonefang tunnels was to be the cradle of the flame god. It was not a mine, but an altar built to beckon the flame lurker. The Slayer realizes that the miners weren't digging for iron. They were digging for their own destruction, unearthing a heat that would consume the world. The rise of the unstoppable heat is the final fever of the buried city, where the Digger King found that the bottom of the world was made of fire. The legacy of Stonefang in this chapter is the horror of the smothering heat. We realize that industry without rest is just a self-hammering anvil. The purpose of the workshop of the earth was to turn men into ore, and the fall was the final smelting. As the Slayer wipes the soot from their brow and looks into the orange abyss of the deeper shafts, they understand that the history of the excavators is the history of the pit, a pit that swallowed the sun and gave back only cinders and smoke. The 7th chapter in our 15-part chronicle of the world ignites within the crucible of the core, where we encounter the most viciously active entity in the history of Stonefang, the Flame Lurker. While the Tower Knight was a stationary fortress, and the Penetrator was a needle of silver, the Flame Lurker represents the lore of the unbound kinetic. He is a primal demon, a being of pure combustion and violent, unstoppable energy that resides in the massive temple at the heart of the deepest tunnels. His purpose is the forging of the apocalypse. He is the living engine that keeps the Stonefang fever at a constant boiling point. The history of the Flame Lurker is the history of the bound demon, an ancient power of the earth that was chained by the ancestors of the miners and unleashed by the soul hunger of King Allant. His awakening reveals that the light of the kingdom was not found in the sun, but in the rage of the magma. The lore of the ancient ceiling provides the historical weight of this encounter. Long before the Allant dynasty, the legendary Big M, the smithing deity of the Shadowmen and the miners, realized that the primal fire of the earth was too wild and hungry for man to control. The lore suggests that the temple where the Flame Lurker resides was originally a prison of obsidian. The pillars of stone and the lava pits were designed to dampen his heat and stifle his movements. His purpose was to be a passive battery for the forge, providing a controlled spark for the industry. However, when the colorless fog arrived, it dissolved the chains. The Old One awakened the Flame Lurker, turning his energy from productive to destructive. This reveals the volatile purpose of the fall. The Old One does not create evil. It removes the inhibitions of the primal forces. The rise of the Flame Lurker was the meltdown of the industrial heart. The physical combat of the Flame Lurker provides insight into the relentless entropy of the fall. Unlike other demons who have patterns, logic, or stately grace, the Flame Lurker is erratic and explosive. He pounces, smashes, and slashes with a frenzy that suggests he is burning himself out as he fights. The lore of the infinite combustion explains that his purpose is the acceleration of the end. He represents the panic of a world that is running out of time. This was the era of the thermal collapse. This reveals the chaotic purpose of the Old One's influence. It wants the heat to be uncontrollable. The rise of the fire demon was the shattering of the forge's discipline, where the rhythmic hammer was replaced by the sudden blast. The relationship between the Flame Lurker and the legendary smith, Ed, offers a poignant look at the fading craft of the North. Ed is the only human remnant who remembers how to work with the heat of a demon. The lore of the searing knowledge suggests that the Flame Lurker's soul is the only thing capable of transcending the limitations of steel. This was the era of the demonic blacksmith. Ed's purpose is to harness the sin of the Flame Lurker to make the Slayer stronger. This reveals the transmutative purpose of the fall. the history of Stonefang moved from hardstone to searing soul metal. This shows that the only way to survive the fog was to become as hot as the demon itself. The rise of the advanced forging was the final testament of the human will to compete with the apocalypse. Furthermore, the lore of the red-hot demon soul represents the catalyst of evolution. The soul is described as pulsing with a life force that refuses to die even when separated from the body. This reveals the will of the ember. The flame lurker was not soulless like the dreglings. He was oversouled. He had too much life for his physical form to contain. The purpose of the red-hot soul was the igniting of potential. It allows Ed to unlock the true history of the weapons, turning a scrap of iron into a godslayer. This shows that the history of the flame lurker is a history of the spark, where the demolition of the old world provided the heat necessary to forge the new one. The rise of the embered soul is the birth of the counterscourge. The lore of the presence of the bone represents the hierarchical heat of the tunnels. The flame lurker is merely the acolyte of a much larger power. He stands before the great ribs of the dragon god, guarding the final secret of the earth. His purpose was to be the sentry of the pyre. He ensured that only the hottest soul, one capable of withstanding his explosion, could witness the origin. This reveals the theological purpose of the Stonefang fall. The miners were unearthing a god, and the flame lurker was the burning veil that protected the sacred center. The rise of the fire was the preparing of the altar for the archdemon of the flame. The act concludes with the extinguishing of the brand. When the flame lurker finally falls, the lava in the pits seems to dim, and the roar of the furnace quietens. The Slayer realizes that they have stolen the fire from the engine of the north. The purpose of the flame lurker was to be the test of pure will. He was the obstacle of raw energy, and his fall is the cooling of the king's industrial ambition. The Slayer understands that the bottom of the world is now reachable, and the Ancient One is waiting in the ash. The rise of the silence in the temple is the final breath of the active core. The legacy of the flame lurker in this chapter is the horror of unstoppable aggression. We realize that power without control is just a beautiful conflagration. The purpose of the workshop of the deep was to capture the lightning, and the flame lurker was the lightning that escaped the jar. As the Slayer holds the glowing soul of the demon, feeling the heat seep through their gauntlets and into their skin, they understand that the history of the flame lurker is the history of the blast, a blast that cleared the way for the end of the world, proving that the flame always consumes the hand that tries to hold it. The 8th chapter in our 15-part chronicle reaches the absolute floor of the world, where the subterranean heat of Stonefang gives way to the ancient weight of prehistory. Here, in a cavern that predates the very concept of the North, the Slayer confronts the dragon god, the archdemon of the second archstone. While the flame lurker was the active, burning fire, the dragon god represents the lore of the fossilized divinity. He is a being of such titanic, impossible proportions that he is woven into the very architecture of the earth. His purpose is the territorial assertion of the primeval. He is the source from which the flame lurker and the stone miners unknowingly drew their molten strength. The transformation of this ancient fossil into a living nightmare reveals the Old One's ultimate archaeological cruelty. It does not just create new demons, it reanimates the sovereignty of the past to crush the presumption of the present. The history of the dragon god is the history of the end of the industrial era, where man's machinery was used to execute the very god they tried to unearth. The lore of the primordial fossil provides the foundation for the geological terror of this encounter. In the ages before the first king of Boletaria, the dragon god was the apex of the world, a being of magma and bone, who eventually became the mountain. The lore suggests that the Stonefang miners were not just digging for ore, they were grave robbers. They built their smithing grounds atop the ribs of a god, mistaking his scales for iron. His purpose was to remain a silent foundation. However, when the colorless fog saturated the rock, it jump-started the heart of the earth. The Old One recalled the dragon god's will, giving life to a landmark. This reveals the restorative purpose of the fall. The Old One undoes the civilization of man by restoring the dominion of the beast. The rise of the dragon god was the death of the geological peace. The physical nature of the encounter, a stealth mission through debris and ruin, provides insight into the human insignificance of the fall. Against the dragon god, sword and shield are mere toys. The lore of the scale of the divine explains that his purpose is the total negation of the individual. One sigh from his nostrils is a firestorm. One punch is an earthquake that reshapes the cavern. This was the era of the crushing reality. This reveals the humiliating purpose of the Old One's influence. It wants the Slayer to feel like an ant crawling across a corpse. The rise of the Stone God was the final proof that Allant's industrial ambition was a child's game played on the back of a sleeping giant. The relationship between the dragon god and the massive ballistae represents the irony of the engineering. These weapons, the Godslayer spears, were built by the ancestors of the miners, the legendary Big M, not to kill the god, but to keep it bound should it ever stir. The lore of the shackles of the spear suggests that the industrial workshop was originally a containment facility. The purpose of the ballistae was the maintenance of the grave. It is the ultimate irony that the Slayer must use man's tools to finish the job that the fog interrupted. This reveals the cyclical purpose of the fall. Technology is the only thing that can clean up the mess that ambition created. The rise of the Godslayer spear was the final act of the Stonefang engineers, proving that man's greatest invention was a funeral rite. Furthermore, the lore of the dragon demon soul represents the inertia of the infinite. The soul is described as immensely heavy and radiates a heat that never cools. This reveals the permanent consequence of the fall. The dragon god's soul is the root of the element. The purpose of the dragon soul was the anchoring of the element. It provided the geological weight necessary to keep the tunnels from collapsing into nothingness. This shows that the history of the dragon god is a history of the anchor, where the demolition of the god provided the foundation for the Slayer's ascension. The rise of the colossal soul in the hands of the Slayer is the only way to fuel the highest arts of fire and wrath. The lore of the lava pits, which dry up upon the god's death, represents the thermal exhaustion of the district. When the dragon god dies, the blood of the earth stops flowing. The purpose of the dragon god was to be the heart of the industry. Without him, Stonefang is just a cold, empty hole in the ground. This reveals the resource dependency of the Allant era. The kingdom was feeding on a corpse, and once the corpse was exorcised, the kingdom had to starve. This was the era of the cold ash. The rise of the silent cavern was the final shuttering of the workshop of the north. The act concludes with the final groan of the crumbling deity. As the dragon god shatters into obsidian dust and cold magma, the archstone of the Digger King is purified. The Slayer realizes that they have toppled a landmark of the universe. The purpose of the dragon god was to be the ultimate ceiling of the material world. He was the physical limit of power, and his fall is the shattering of the earth's pride. The Slayer understands that the second pillar of the Old One has collapsed, and the Tower of Latria is waiting beneath the chilling, rain-slicked sky. The legacy of the dragon god in this chapter is the horror of the ancient weight. We realize that progress was just scraping the surface of an indifferent divinity. The purpose of the workshop of the earth was to wake the god, and the fall was the price of the alarm. As the Slayer stands on the shattered jaw of the fallen deity, feeling the sudden chill of the air, they understand that the history of the dragon god is the history of the mountain, a mountain that looked down on man until it was turned into a monument of its own defeat. The 9th chapter in our 15-part chronicle of the world shifts from the sweltering, mechanical pits of industry to the rain-slicked, suffocating silence of the Tower of Latria. If Stonefang was the body of the world, Latria was its mind, the seat of wisdom, ivory artifice, and the aristocratic elite. The lore of this era is the lore of the intellectual despair. The purpose of Latria was the refinement of the human spirit, a place where the queen of the land ruled over a society of scholars and artists. However, the fall brought a spiritual infection far more insidious than the physical rot of the palace. The history of the Tower of Latria is the history of the madness of the Golden Garb, where the search for truth was replaced by the obsession with pain, and the seat of learning was transformed into a vertical panopticon of eldritch horror. The lore of the exile of the queen provides the cultural tragedy of the district. The Queen of Latria was a figure of grace and purity, but she was usurped by her own husband, a man known only as the Old Monk. The lore suggests that the monk was banished from the ivory towers for his dark interests, only to return during the fog's arrival draped in a living, parasitic golden robe. His purpose shifted from governance to the systematic humiliation of the intellect. He cast the queen into the fog and turned her ivory towers into iron cages. This reveals the vindictive purpose of the fall. The Old One uses resentment as a catalyst. The monk did not just want to rule Latria, he wanted to deconstruct it. The rise of the Old Monk was the fall of the Latrian dignity, proving that knowledge without empathy is the shortest path to divine madness. The physical environment of the Prison of Hope provides insight into the acoustic horror of the fall. The tower is filled with the constant ringing of bells and the moans of the damned. The lore of the measured suffering explains that the purpose of the prison became the rhythmic extraction of sanity. The mind flayers, the squid-headed jailers, patrol the halls with magic and bell. Their purpose was the policing of the thought. They do not just guard the body, they paralyze the soul with their bells. This reveals the cerebral purpose of the Old One's influence. It wants to free the mind from its human constraints by breaking it through repetitive trauma. This was the era of the Iron Maiden. The rise of the jailer was the death of the student. The relationship between the prisoners and the fool's idol represents the theological trap of the fall. In the grand chapel of the prison, a beautiful, four-armed woman preaches a gospel of hope. The lore suggests that the idol is a clockwork mockery, created by the monk to look like the missing queen. Her purpose was the maintenance of the false hope. By giving the prisoners a false god to worship, the monk ensured they would never rebel against their chains. This reveals the manipulative purpose of the Old One. It uses religion to harvest the devotion of the desperate. The rise of the Clockwork Queen was the sealing of the Latrian spirit, turning a sanctuary into a theater of deception. Furthermore, the lore of the man-eaters and the heart of the tower represents the biological blasphemy of the upper reaches. In the swampy, fleshy depths of the towers, the monk began to synthesize life. The lore of the meat of the mind suggests that the massive beating heart, suspended by chains, is the engine of the monk's power. The purpose of this gore engine was the industrialization of the soul. It creates the gargoyles and the man-eaters, unnatural hybrids of human and beast. This reveals the experimental purpose of the Latrian fall. The mind was used to overthrow biology. This shows that the history of Latria is a history of the scalpel, where the search for enlightenment was replaced by the assembly line of the monstrous. The lore of the sage freak, the visionary, represents the dangerous curiosity of the scholar. Freak seeks the soul arts not to serve the Old One, but to understand them. His purpose is the intellectual theft of the fire. He is the human reflection of the monk's ambition. He realizes that magic is a primal force that can be weaponized by the will. This reveals the immoral purpose of the fall. Knowledge is neutral, but in a rotting world, it becomes a curse. The rise of the advanced sorcery was the end of the traditional prayer, where man sought to hack the reality of the fog. The act concludes with the ascension to the spire in the upper Latria. As the Slayer cuts the chains holding the Great Heart, the physical center of the monk's delusion collapses. The purpose of the Tower of Latria was to be the altar of the ego. It was not a prison, but an observation deck for the end of the world. The Slayer realizes that the monk wasn't ruling, he was auditioning for the Old One. The rise of the Golden Mist is the final breath of the scholarly nightmare. The legacy of Latria in this chapter is the horror of the chilling isolation. We realize that wisdom without compassion is just a beautiful cage. The purpose of the workshop of the mind was to turn men into stars, and the fall was the turning of the stars into dust. As the Slayer stands on the lattice walkways under the green moonlight, they understand that the history of the monk is the history of the shroud, a shroud that wrapped the world in gold until it suffocated. The 10th chapter in our 15-part chronicle of the world ascends the final, spiraling staircase of the ivory tower to confront the silent sovereignty of Latria, the old monk. This encounter is unique in the history of the fall, for it represents the lore of the absentee tyrant, the man who was once the husband of the queen, the same man who sought the dark arts and returned to enslave his people, is now a withered skeletal husk, slumped upon a throne of rotting ivory. The true power, the true demon, is the golden garb, a massive, tattered, parasitic cloth that has wrapped itself around his body and mind. The purpose of the old monk is the testing of the surrogate. He does not fight his own battles. He summons the souls of other hunters to act as his vessel. The history of the old monk is the history of the parasitic robe, where the clothing became the king and the king became a prop. The lore of the living garb provides the metaphysical horror of the Latrian apex. The golden garb is not a garment, but a demon of influence. It is a manifestation of the eldritch vanity that the Old One harvested from the monk's deep-seated resentment and envy. Its purpose was the externalization of the ego. The robe feeds on the hate of the wearer, granting them infinite arcane power at the cost of their autonomy. This was the era of the puppet king. The monk believed he was using the power of the soul to reclaim his stolen kingdom, but the robe was merely using him to stabilize the fog in the east. This reveals the adulterating purpose of the fall. The Old One rewards human ambition by replacing the ambitious with a soulless construct. The rise of the golden garb was the fall of the individual will. The physical nature of the battle, where the monk summons a player or a phantom from another world to fight in his stead, provides insight into the delegated cruelty of the fall. The lore of the soul call explains that the purpose of the monk is the corruption of the savior. By forcing a hunter to defend the throne of a demon, the old monk and the robe proves that anyone can be bought or bowed by the soul arts. This was the era of the mercenary demon. This reveals the social nihilism of the Old One's influence. It wants to turn the heroes against one another. The rise of the summoned rival was the final destruction of the Brotherhood of the North, turning the quest for salvation into a duel of the damned. The relationship between the old monk and the homing soul arrow, the floating orbs of light that guard the throne, represents the automated intelligence of the fall. Even as a husk, the monk's will is projected into the air as lethal geometry. The lore suggests that these orbs are the fragmented thoughts of the monk's madness. Their purpose was the defensive autonomy of the mind. The monk no longer needs to think to kill. The robe does it for him. This reveals the alienating purpose of the Latrian fall. The mind has become so refined and cold that it functions like a machine. This was the era of the disembodied wrath. The rise of the auto-sorcery was the death of the creative intellect. Furthermore, the lore of the yellow head wrap, the item gained by those who serve the monk, represents the viral spread of the insanity. To wear the wrap is to invite the robe into one's own mind. The lore of the crown of the parasite suggests that the golden wisdom it provides is a lethal injection of insight. The purpose of the wrap was the propagation of the golden cult. The monk wanted to ensure that even if he died, his aesthetic of pain would live on in the minds of the survivors. This shows that the history of Latria is a history of the infection, where the golden thread of the robe sews the nightmare into the fabric of reality. The rise of the yellow cultist is the final legacy of the monk's resentment. The lore of the yellow demon soul, the item dropped upon the monk's death, represents the essence of the usurper. The soul is described as bright, arrogant, and ravenous. This reveals the vampiric nature of the Latrian throne. The monk didn't earn his power through discipline. He siphoned it from the queen and the prisoners of the tower. The purpose of the yellow soul was the anchoring of the illusion. It was the battery for the fool's idol and the man-eaters. This shows that the history of the old monk is a history of the voided marriage, where the bond of love was burned to light the lamp of the demon. The rise of the yellow soul in the hands of the slayer is the only way to master the insanity of the homing soul. The act concludes with the silent crumbling of the monk's brittle bones. When the robe is defeated, it does not die. It fades into the fog, leaving the frail body of the man to finally turn to dust in the rain. The slayer realizes that they have shattered a mirror rather than killing a god. The purpose of the old monk was to be the ultimate proxy. He was the human shield for the eldritch garb, and his fall is the shattering of the ivory illusion. The slayer understands that the third pillar of the old one has collapsed, and the shrine of storms is waiting beneath the crying, cursed sky. The legacy of the old monk in this chapter is the horror of the parasitic robe. We realize that power without personhood is just a golden shroud. The purpose of the workshop of the spire was to dress the dead in gold, and the fall was the final unraveling. As the slayer looks at the empty throne of Latria, they understand that the history of the old monk is the history of the costume, a costume that wore the man until there was nothing left inside. The 11th chapter in our 15-part chronicle of the world drifts away from the mainland to the jagged, rain-battered cliffs of the Shrine of Storms. If Latria was the mind of the world, the shrine represents the spirit of the ancestors, a site of ancient, primal ritual where the shadow men worship the wind, the rain, and the great storm beast. The lore of this era is the lore of the eternal tempest. The purpose of the shrine was the sanctification of the dead. For centuries, the shadow men brought their deceased to these cliffs, believing that the storm would carry their souls to a sky kingdom. However, the fall of Boletaria brought an eldritch reanimation to these sacred rites. The history of the Shrine of Storms is the history of the burial of the sky god, where the hope of afterlife was turned into a cycle of ravenous rebirth, and the ancestors were recalled as skeletal sentinels of the fog. The lore of the Shadowman's Covenant provides the cultural foundation for the island's corruption. These were a people who did not fear death, but welcomed it as a transition. The lore suggests that they used soul remains, the crystallized essence of the departed, to beckon the storm beasts to feed on the essence of the dead, believing this act freed the spirit. When the colorless fog arrived, it overwhelmed the ritual. The Old One did not just observe the covenant, it hijacked it. The purpose of the shrine shifted from funerary honor to atmospheric consumption. The fog condensed the spirits of the dead into hardened bone, creating the silver skeletons and gold skeletons that now haunt the cliffs. This reveals the recycling purpose of the fall. The Old One uses the traditions of the past as a blueprint for its undead army. The rise of the skeleton soldier was the fall of the peaceful grave. The physical environment of the island's edge provides insight into the aerodynamic horror of the fall. Unlike the claustrophobic tunnels of Stonefang, the shrine is wide open to the violence of the sky. The storm beasts, giant, flying rays, patrol the air, spitting barbs of bone at any intruder. Their purpose was the patrol of the horizon. They are the hounds of the storm, ensuring that no soul escapes the island. This reveals the sequestration purpose of the Old One's influence. It wants to trap the spirit within the circulation of the storm. This was the era of the sky jail. The rise of the storm beast was the death of the horizon, where the sky itself became a wall of pointed malice. The relationship between the Shadow Men and the Adjudicator represents the moral mutilation of the fall. Deep within the ruins sits a bloated, golden-scaled demon with a second tongue emerging from its head and a golden bird perched atop its crown. The lore suggests the Adjudicator was the judge of the dead, an ancient idol who determined if a soul was fit for the storm based on its purity. The Old One turned this judgment into a gluttonous evaluation. His purpose was the tasting of the sin. He literally eats the unworthy. This reveals the visceral purpose of the fall. The abstract laws of the Shadow Men were metified. The rise of the Adjudicator was the souring of the sacred law, turning a divine decree into a feeding trough. Furthermore, the lore of the old hero represents the blind loyalty of the ancestral spirit. Deep in the path of shadows, the Slayer encounters a towering, eyeless warrior wielding a large sword of searching. The lore suggests he is the primeval ancestor of the Shadow Men, a hero so ancient he predates the gift of sight. His purpose was the sentinel of the silent grave. He hears the echoes of the living and crushes them to maintain the quiet of the dead. This reveals the relentless purpose of the fall. Even the heroes of old are drafted into the service of the fog. This shows that the history of the shrine is a history of the echo, where greatness is reduced to vibration and violence. The lore of the Storm Ruler, the legendary sword found at the monolith, represents the mythic countermeasure. This weapon, which cleaves the sky, was the only tool the Shadow Men had to control the god. Its purpose was the ritualized regicide. It was used once an age to slay the storm and reset the cycle of the island. This reveals the self-correcting purpose of the ancient world. They knew the gods would eventually become too hungry, and they forged the solution into the earth. The rise of the Storm Ruler in the hands of the Slayer is the final acknowledgement that man must kill his own gods to clear the air. The act concludes with the descent of the Storm King. As the Slayer reaches the monolith of the sky, the clouds themselves take form. The Storm King is the archdemon of the air, a creature of pure storm and endless wings. The purpose of the Storm King was to be the vacuum of the spirit. He sucks the souls from the graves and delivers them directly to the Old One. The Slayer realizes that the shrine wasn't a church, it was a funnel. The rise of the Great Ray is the final harvest of the Shadowman's hope. The legacy of the Shrine of Storms in this chapter is the horror of the eternal tempest. We realize that tradition without life is just a repetitive haunting. The purpose of the Workshop of the Sky was to send the soul upward, and the fall was the slamming of the sky's door. As the Slayer stands on the shattered monolith amidst the carcasses of the storm beasts, they understand that the history of the Shadow Men is the history of the rain, a rain that washes the memory until only the bone remains. The 12th chapter in our 15-part chronicle of the world descends into the sinking heart of the kingdom's geography, the Valley of Defilement. If the Shrine of Storms was the spirit, the valley is the excrement of Boletaria, a toxic, sunless abyss where the kingdom cast its unwanted. The lore of this era is the lore of the squalor of the damned. The purpose of the valley was the social purgation. For centuries, the depraved ones, the sick, the leprous, and the unwanted infants, were thrown into this pit to be forgotten by the high stone of the palace. However, the fall brought a nurturing corruption to this rot. The history of the Valley of Defilement is the history of the lore of the unwanted, where the abject poverty of the flesh became a holy crusade of the filth, and the refuse of man was sanctified by a saint of the poisoned blood. The lore of the depraved covenant provides the harrowing social foundation for the valley's existence. These inhabitants were the byproducts of perfection. To maintain the purity of the Allant dynasty, anything imperfect was discarded. The lore suggests that the depraved ones did not fall to the fog. They were already fallen. When the colorless fog arrived, it did not find ambition or greed, but Suffering. The Old One magnified this suffering, turning their physical rot into a biological weapon. The purpose of the valley shifted from forgotten grave to incubator of the plague. This reveals the shadow purpose of the fall. The Old One empowers the victims of the old world to destroy the architects of their pain. The rise of the depraved one was the final bill for the palace's arrogance. The physical environment of the leechmonger's pit provides insight into the viscous horror of the fall. The valley is not stone, but slime. The leechmonger, a mass of writhing blood-sucking worms, represents the cohesion of the filth. Its purpose was the recycling of the vitality. It gathers the bleeding souls of the valley and concentrates them into a single, pulsing cyst. This reveals the organic purpose of the Old One's influence. It wants the decay to be productive. This was the era of the parasitic bloom. The rise of the leech demon was the death of the individual organism, where life became a single, throbbed mass of hunger. The relationship between the valley and the dirty colossus represents the atmospheric smog of the fall. Guarding the entrance to the inner swamp, the colossus is a being of condensed filth and plague insects. The lore suggests he is the literal accumulated dust of the valley's history. His purpose was the filtration of the light. He ensures that nothing clean or pure can survive the passage into the deeper swamp. This reveals the insulating purpose of the fall. The wickedness of the world is wrapped in layers of excrement to prevent salvation from reaching the core. The rise of the plague giant was the final seal on the pit of the unwanted. Furthermore, the lore of the maiden Astrea represents the blasphemous mercy of the fall. Astrea was a sixth saint of the church, a woman of unmatched compassion who traveled to the valley to soothe the suffering. When she saw that the god she worshipped had abandoned these people, she accepted the soul of a demon to gain the power to heal them. The lore of the sin of empathy suggests that her purpose was the sanctification of the rot. She turned the demonic power into a lullaby for the dying. This reveals the subversive purpose of the fall. The purest soul became the cruelest demon by refusing to let go of the pain. This shows that the history of the valley is a history of the tears, where love was infected until it became a lethal devotion. The lore of Garl Vinland represents the immovable protection of the lost cause. Astrea's knight, clad in brammed and dark silver, stands as the last guard of the swamp. His purpose was the preservation of the sanctuary. He does not fight for the Old One or for Allant, but for the peace of the woman he loves. This reveals the tragic integrity of the fall. Even demons have protectors. This was the era of the Dark Silver Vigil. The rise of the Knight of the Mire was the final barrier between the Slayer and the heart of the defilement. The act concludes with the suicide of the saint. When Garl Vinland falls, Astrea relinquishes her soul, realizing that her sanctuary has been breached. The purpose of the Valley of Defilement was to be the womb of the demon. It was not a sewage pipe, but an altar of sorrow. The Slayer realizes that evil is not always vile. Sometimes it is simply desperate. The rise of the blood-stained soul is the final sob of the unwanted millions. The legacy of the Valley of Defilement in this chapter is the horror of the sinking heart. We realize that purity is a lie bought with the suffering of the lowly. The purpose of the workshop of the mire was to bury the sin, and the fall was the bubbling up of the truth. As the Slayer stands in the toxic stillness of the final pool, they understand that the history of Astrea is the history of the cradle, a cradle that rocked the dying until the world itself choked on the scent of the rot. The 13th chapter in our 15-part chronicle of the world returns us to the center of the wheel, the eternal suspension of the Nexus. Throughout the Slayer's journey into the 5 fractured realms, the Nexus has served as a sanctuary of cold stone and flickering candles, a liminal space existing between the world of the living and the fathomless deep. However, the lore of this temple is the lore of the Golden Cage. Its purpose was never merely to be a hub for travelers, but to be the metaphysical anchor of the world's survival. It is the workshop of the soul, a laboratory where the fundamental essence of man is processed, refined, and ultimately stored. The history of the Nexus is the history of the memory of the Monumentals, where the cost of order is revealed to be the sacrifice of freedom, and the sanctuary is revealed to be a mausoleum of the spirit. The lore of the bound maiden, the maiden in black, provides the spiritual heartbeat of the temple. She is a figure of infinite patience and eternal sorrow, her eyes waxed shut to prevent her from seeing the reality of the souls she manipulates. The lore suggests that she is not human, but the oldest and most powerful demon. Her purpose was the mediated mercy. By chaining herself to the Nexus, she acts as the gatekeeper of the soul arts. She feeds the Slayer's power, yet she does so only to ensure that a champion is created who can lull the old one back to sleep. This reveals the symbiotic purpose of the fall. The enemy is also the key. The rise of the maiden was the preservation of the cycle, proving that salvation requires a demon of moderation to hold back the demon of devouring. The physical environment of the Great Hall provides insight into the archaeological grief of the fall. Scattered along the upper balconies are the Monumentals, withered, childlike beings who resemble statues of flesh. The lore of the last Monumental explains that they are the living memories of the first scourge. Their purpose was the universal record. They remember the names of every hero who has ever entered the fog and never returned. This reveals the observational purpose of the Nexus. It is a mirror of futility. The rise of the Monumental was the end of human history, where events were replaced by eternal vigilance. This was the era of the frozen moment. The history of the Nexus is the history of the witness, where life is merely a variable in the equation of the deep. The relationship between the stockpile Thomas, the blacksmith Boldwin, and the disciple of God represents the fragmented support of the fall. These survivors are bound to the Nexus, unable to leave but safe from the fog. The lore suggests that their sanity is maintained only by their obsession with their craft. Their purpose was the material maintenance of the Slayer. They provide the steel, the storage, and the faith necessary for the hunt. This reveals the utility of the remnant. The Old One allows small pockets of order to exist so that the great harvest can be organized. This was the era of the necessary echo. The rise of the Nexus survivors was the end of the world's future, leaving behind only a service industry for the end times. Furthermore, the lore of the soul-starved suicides represents the psychological attrition of the temple. The crestfallen warrior, who sits by the central archstone, is the avatar of the quitter. The lore of the fading spark suggests that the Nexus is a spirit trap. Once a soul is tied to the temple, it can never truly die. It can only fade until it dissolves into the stone. His purpose was the warning of the exhausted. He shows the Slayer that determination is the only shield against the void. This reveals the attrition purpose of the fall. The temple is designed to wait out the hero. This shows that the history of the Nexus is a history of the sigh, where hope is eroded by the immensity of the task. The lore of the locked archstone, the broken stone of the giants, represents the irreparable loss of the fall. In the ancient past, a sixth kingdom existed, a land of snow and giants. The lore of the Shattered Link suggests that this realm was consumed entirely during the first scourge, forcing the Monumentals to break the archstone to prevent the void from bleeding into the Nexus. This reveals the amputation purpose of the world's leaders. They would destroy a kingdom to save a universe. This was the era of the cold severance. The rise of the broken stone was the final admission that total salvation is impossible. There are parts of the world that can never be recovered. The act concludes with the awakening of the seals. As the Slayer defeats the 5 archdemons, the floor of the Nexus begins to vibrate with an eldritch light. The purpose of the Slayer's journey was to be the collector of the final keys. The seals that kept the Old One in the deep are now shattered by the very success of the hero. The Slayer realizes that by cleansing the world, they have opened the door to the source. The rise of the stairway to the deep is the final movement of the temple's liturgy. The legacy of the Nexus in this chapter is the horror of the eternal suspension. We realize that safety is just a waiting room for the abyss. The purpose of the workshop of the temple was to keep the world in a coma, and the fall was the sudden awakening. As the Slayer looks at the maiden in black, seeing the black slime begin to seep from the floor, they understand that the history of the Nexus is the history of the bridge, a bridge that connected the stars but was built over the mouth of the beast. The 14th chapter in our 15-part chronicle of the world descends beneath the foundations of the Nexus into the pathetic truth that lies at the center of the colorless fog. This is the lore of the final descent. Having shattered the seals of the 5 archstones, the Slayer is led by the maiden in black into the physical belly of the Old One. Here, the grandeur of the palace, the heat of the tunnels, and the gold of Latria are absent. There is only a sea of white mist and a gnarled, organic cathedral made of eldritch roots. At the heart of this void lies the true King Allant, the man who invited the end of the world. However, the history of this encounter is the history of the consumption of the ego, where the great king of the north is revealed to be nothing more than a slug-like parasite, a blob of distilled regret wallowing in the internal filth of the beast he thought he could control. The lore of the king's final sermon provides the nihilistic philosophy behind the kingdom's collapse. When the Slayer confronts the true Allant, he does not speak of glory or power, he speaks of mercy. The lore suggests that Allant's descent into madness was fueled by a rational despair. He looked at the cycle of human history, the endless wars, the suffering, and the inevitable decay, and concluded that life was a cruel prank played by a silent universe. His purpose shifted to the universal euthanasia. He believed the Old One was a savior because it offered a painless end to the agony of existence. This reveals the theological suicide of the Allant era. The father of the nation decided that the children should no longer breathe. The rise of the Slug King was the final admission that humanity had resigned its right to exist. The physical combat with the true king, a slow, miserable struggle against a being that can barely lift its sword, provides insight into the degradation of the soul arts. While the false king was a radiant god, the true king is a withered remnant. This reveals the entropic purpose of the fall. The Old One does not grant power, it digests it. Allant thought he was drinking from the source, but he was being dissolved by it. The lore of the parasitic exchange explains that Allant's purpose was to be the internal voice of the fog. He acted as the liaison between the human world and the divine void, but the cost was his physical form. This was the era of the melted majesty. The history of the deep is the history of the mucus, where greatness was liquefied into apathy. The relationship between Allant and the Soulbrand represents the manifestation of malice. In his slug-like hand, he clutches the twin blade to the demon brand. The lore suggests that Soulbrand's power is inversely proportional to the character of the wielder. In Allant's hands, it is a weapon of pure hatred. Its purpose was the execution of the future. It represents the final tool of a jealous king who would slay the world rather than see it outlast him. This reveals the vindictive purpose of the Allant fall. He did not just want to end the pain, he wanted to erase the potential. This was the era of the final blade. The rise of the soul-eating sword was the end of the legacy, where the last king used the last power to cut the last thread of hope. Furthermore, the lore of the Old One's stomach represents the metabolization of reality. The environment inside the beast is composed of petrified history, the roots and ruins of civilizations that were eaten long before Boletaria was born. The lore of the endless digestion suggests that the Old One is a living record of extinction. Its purpose was the recycling of the cosmos. This reveals the environmental purpose of the fall. The fog is a natural solvent that cleans the slate of the universe when it becomes too complex or too greedy. This was the era of the cosmic reset. This shows that the history of the deep is a history of the mouth, where progress is just a flavor for the void. The lore of the Demon Brant and Soul Brant, the North Regalia, represents the final symmetry of the North. When the two blades are joined, they become the true symbol of the kingdom. The lore suggests that the Regalia was intended to be a compass for the ruler, a reminder that a king must balance will with empathy. Allant's failure was his abandonment of the balance. By choosing only the Soul Brant, he chose hatred over harmony. The purpose of the combined blade was the sovereign restoration. In the hands of the Slayer, it becomes the tool to sever the connection between the man and the monster. This reveals the redemptive purpose of the fall. The tools of the tyrant can be forged into the keys of the savior. The act concludes with the final groan of the Slug King. As Allant dies, he whispers a warning to the Slayer. No one wishes to go on. He dies not as a demon, but as a pity-inducing wreck. The Slayer realizes that the enemy was never a god, but a coward who was afraid of the dark. The purpose of the true king was to be the ultimate reflection of human weakness. He was the shadow that Allant cast when he turned his back on the sun. The Slayer understands that the throne is gone, the king is dead, and only the decision of the soul remains. The legacy of the true king in this chapter is the horror of the pathetic truth. We realize that evil is often just exhaustion wearing a crown. The purpose of the workshop of the deep was to deconstruct the king, and the fall was the final puddle. As the Slayer stands over the dissolving remains of Allant 12, holding the Soul Brant in the silent fog, they understand that the history of Allant is the history of the surrender, a surrender that sold the world for a moment of peace in the belly of the beast. The 15th and final chapter of our chronicle reaches the ultimate conclusion, the moment where the history of the world ceases to be a record of the past and becomes a decision for the future. Having silenced the Slug King and stood at the center of the Old One, the Slayer is no longer a hunter, but the arbiter of existence. The lore of this final hour is the lore of the eternal choice, the colorless fog that has choked the north and consumed the 5 archstones now waits for a command. The purpose of the entire scourge, the demons, the pain, and the harvest, was to test the marrow of the successor. The history of the end is the history of the silence of the world, where the Slayer must decide if the cycle of ambition is worth resurrecting, or if the peace of the void is the only true mercy. The lore of the Lullaby of the Maiden provides the first path, the restoration of the boundary. The Maiden in Black, revealed as a spirit of the deep who chose to love the world, offers to lead the Old One back into its great slumber. Her purpose is the sacrifice of the divine power. If the Slayer allows her to proceed, she will draw the fog back into herself and the beast, sealing the soul arts away forever. This reveals the anticlimactic salvation of the good ending. Saving the world means making it ordinary. The lore suggests that the age of man can only begin when the age of wonder and its inherent terror is extinguished. This was the era of the great forgetting. The rise of the new world is the fall of the supernatural, proving that peace is a quiet, mundane thing built on the burying of the truth. The physical aftermath of this choice, the clearing of the skies over the Boletarian palace and the stillness of the Stonefang tunnels, provides insight into the environmental recovery of the fall. The lore of the Fog's retreat explains that the world does not heal instantly. It resets. The demons vanish, leaving behind empty armor and cold ash. The purpose of this retreat was the granting of a second chance. This reveals the cyclical mercy of the Monumentals design. The system worked, but at the cost of the soul. This was the era of the silent reconstruction. The history of the North becomes a history of the scars, where the survivors look at the clear sky and forget the nightmare that almost sucked the stars from the firmament. However, the lore of the temptation of the dark provides the second, terrible path, the ascension of the new demon. If the slayer slays the maiden, instead of letting her lull the beast, they inherit the will of all Allant. The lore suggests that the Old One is always looking for a mind to direct its hunger. By killing the last bridge to the old world, the Slayer becomes the Old One's newest and greatest demon. Their purpose shifts from Slayer to Engine of the Apocalypse. This reveals the predatory logic of the fall. The hero was merely the strongest soul in the larder, and the Old One was testing them to see if they were worthy to rule the emptiness. This was the era of the Eternal Night. The rise of the Demon King is the final erasure of the human spirit. The relationship between the Slayer and the soul of the Maiden in Black represents the ultimate power of the core. In the dark path, the Slayer consumes her essence. The lore of the unbound soul suggests that this act grants the Slayer a power that rivals the gods. The purpose of this power was the completion of the void. It allows the colorless fog to spread beyond the north, covering the entirety of the earth in a uniform, gray silence. This shows that the history of the fall is a history of the hunger, where the only end is the total consumption of everything that is. The rise of the infinite mist is the final chapter of the cosmic book, where the pages are turned to dust. Furthermore, the lore of the new Monumental, in the good ending, represents the burden of the Watcher. The Slayer, having saved the world, must eventually take a seat in the Nexus alongside the withered children. The lore of the Eternal Vigilance suggests that the price of safety is stagnation. The Slayer must become a statue to ensure the Old One does not wake again. This reveals the melancholic purpose of the fall's conclusion. The hero does not get to live in the world they saved. They must exit history to protect history. This shows that the history of demon souls is a history of the sacrifice, where victory is just another word for honorable imprisonment. The act concludes with the final fade to black. As the Maiden's song echoes through the Nexus for the last time, the screen of reality closes. The purpose of the complete chronicle was to expose the anatomy of a collapse. We realize that Boletaria was not destroyed by demons, but by the human refusal to accept limits. The Old One was merely the mirror of that refusal. The Slayer understands that whether they save the world or consume it, the age of magic is over, and the age of memory has begun. The legacy of the fall of Boletaria in this final chapter is the horror of the eternal choice. We realize that God is not good or evil, it is hungry, and man is the only thing that can choose to feed it or starve it. The purpose of the workshop of the universe was to produce a choice, and the Slayer was the final hand on the lever of fate. As the fog either retreats or triumphs, we understand that the history of demon souls is the history of the breath, a breath that was drawn in greed, held in fear, and released in the silent, cold hope of the end.